What's the most savage thing a judge ever said that made the courtroom go silent? Story 1. I was defending a client in a small claims case over a dog bite. The plaintiff was over-the-top dramatic, claiming emotional trauma, scarring, lifelong fear of dogs, and more. They even brought in a friend to the stand who tried to testify that my client's dog had murderous eyes. Halfway through that testimony, the judge calmly leaned forward, took off his glasses and said, "Are we really going to pretend we're in a courtroom and not an audition for a soap opera?" Everyone froze. The witness looked like she wanted to crawl under the chair. The plaintiff visibly deflated. The case was dismissed shortly after for lack of evidence. But the real win? My client still brings it up every time we chat. Says it was better than the time he won free steak. Story 2. This was a criminal case involving theft from a nursing home. The defendant, a caretaker, had stolen a few $1,000s from several elderly residents. His defense was that the residents didn't know what was going on anyway, and that they wouldn't miss the money. After listening to this guy justify stealing from dementia patients for 15 minutes, the judge looked at him and said very slowly, "If stupidity were a crime, sir, you'd be facing life without parole." The courtroom erupted in laughter, but the judge banged the gavel and said, "Silence, or I'll hold all of you in contempt, including myself for having to listen to that." Dead silence. The defendant just stared ahead, blinking. He was convicted. Story 3. This was during a civil dispute between two brothers over their deceased mother's estate. One of them was clearly trying to twist every clause of the will to his benefit, even accusing his brother of manipulating their mother before her death. At one point, this guy starts fake crying on the stand, dramatically dabbing at dry eyes and saying, "All I ever wanted was to honor my mother's memory." The judge leaned forward, and with the driest tone I've ever heard said, "You honor her memory by looting her estate like a vulture with a law degree?" Silence. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. The brother shut up for the rest of the hearing. Spoiler, he lost badly. Story 4. I was just a law clerk at the time, but I'll never forget it. The defense attorney was one of those arrogant guys who loved to hear himself talk. He kept interrupting the prosecution, the judge, everyone. Even the bailiff got talked over. Eventually, after one too many interruptions, the judge took off his glasses, stood up slightly and said, "Mr. Coleman, if you interrupt one more person in my courtroom, I will hold you in contempt, sentence you to write 'I will not be a pompous jackass' 1,000 times, and read it aloud for the court." Stunned silence. Coleman sat down and didn't say another word unless spoken to. I've never seen a man shrink like that without someone punching him. Story 5. A family court hearing. Ugly custody battle. The dad was smug, rich, and clearly using his money to delay proceedings and manipulate the system. Every hearing he showed up with a new lawyer. This was the fourth, when his new attorney started making vague excuses about scheduling conflicts and how their client is a busy man. The judge had clearly had enough. He stared the dad down and said, "Mr. Wexler, if you put half as much effort into parenting as you do into courtroom gymnastics, your daughter wouldn't cry when she hears your name." You could have heard a pin drop. Even the opposing attorney paused like, "Damn." Mr. Wexler didn't say another word for the rest of the hearing. Full custody to the mom. No contest. Story 6. This happened in traffic court. The defendant was this guy who thought he was way smarter than everyone else. He was fighting a DUI charge and representing himself, which was already a disaster in slow motion. He kept citing obscure laws incorrectly, using legal terms out of context, and even at one point yelled, "Habeas corpus, Your Honor," in response to a question about his blood alcohol level. The judge, clearly done with the nonsense, leaned forward and said, "Sir, this is a courtroom, not a game of Scrabble. Stop tossing around words you don't understand just because you Googled them 5 minutes ago." Dead silence. I think even the stenographer stopped typing for a second. The guy's face turned crimson, and the rest of the trial was short, brutal, and ended in a conviction. Story 7. Divorce case. Husband had been caught cheating multiple times, but somehow still wanted to play the victim. Claimed the wife was too cold, too focused on the kids, and that he just needed to feel appreciated by someone. The judge, an older woman with zero tolerance for BS, listened patiently, then turned to him and said, "Mr. Jackson, what you needed was a therapist, not a mistress. You chose the latter. Actions have consequences, and yours come with child support." I've never seen a grown man sink so deep into a leather chair. His lawyer didn't even try to object. Silence. Pure, icy silence. Story 8. I was working on a pro bono tenant rights case. My client was a single mom being evicted under shady circumstances. The landlord's lawyer was this smug, young guy who clearly thought this was beneath him. He kept making sarcastic comments, even laughing during my client's testimony. The judge had already warned him once, but when he chuckled during her closing statement, the judge leaned forward and said, "Mr. Banks, you may find poverty amusing, but this court does not. One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt and assign you to clean the courthouse bathrooms for a week. Let's see if that wipes the smirk off." You could hear the guy swallow his ego in real time. The courtroom was silent, tense, but also kind of triumphant. My client won. Justice was loud, but the courtroom was silent. Story 9. A corporate fraud case. The CEO on trial had just been caught lying under oath. Nothing massive, but enough to show he was dodgy. When called out, he smiled smugly and said, "Well, Your Honor, I may have misremembered. It's hard to keep track of so many details." Without missing a beat, the judge said, "You seem to have no trouble remembering where to hide money." You could feel the oxygen leave the room. His own attorney turned red. From that moment on, the CEO stared straight ahead, expressionless. He pled out a week later. Story 10. Family court again. A mother fighting to regain custody after getting clean. She was doing everything right. Rehab, job, therapy. The father's attorney tried to paint her as unstable, bringing up stuff from 5 years ago. The judge looked at the attorney and said, "Are we here to punish her for who she was or applaud her for who she's become? Because if it's the former, we're wasting everyone's time." Silence. Genuine, emotional silence. Even the father looked down. The judge granted shared custody. The mother cried. I cried. It was the first time I saw a judge use words to heal a courtroom instead of destroy it, and somehow, it was just as powerful. Story 11. I was a junior associate sitting in on a personal injury case where the plaintiff was blatantly faking an injury. Surveillance footage showed him jogging, dancing at a bar, even lifting weights, all while claiming he couldn't walk without pain. Still, he insisted in court that he couldn't bend, couldn't work, couldn't even sleep. The judge listened for a while, then leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Perkins, were you moonwalking out of the liquor store before or after your debilitating injury?" Silence. Like a vacuum had sucked all the air out of the room. The plaintiff froze. His lawyer just dropped his head into his hands. Case dismissed right then and there. Story 12. This was a probate case. Greedy nephew trying to invalidate a will so he could get a bigger slice of the inheritance. His reasoning? That his elderly aunt wasn't of sound mind when she wrote the will. Problem was, she'd written it before her dementia diagnosis, and she'd even filmed a video explaining her decisions clearly. The judge played the video in court. The aunt, clear as day, looked into the camera and said, "And if you're watching this, Jimmy, I meant to leave you out. You're a snake." Gasps. Stifled laughter. Then the judge, not missing a beat, said, "That settles that. Even the dead think you're full of it." Courtroom. Silent. Jimmy didn't say another word. Story 13. A criminal sentencing. Defendant had a long record. Assault, theft, drugs, but kept insisting he was just misunderstood and never had a fair chance. The judge gave him a long look and said, "You've had more chances than a cat in traffic. What you lack isn't opportunity, it's accountability." Boom. Total silence. No one even breathed. The defendant blinked like he'd been slapped. Sentence handed down moments later. Harsh but fair. Story 14. I was representing a woman in a restraining order case against her ex. The guy was creepy, manipulative, and used the stand to paint her as the crazy one. He even accused her of faking texts he had sent. The judge sat quietly through all of it. Then he asked the bailiff to bring in a printer. Turns out the judge had subpoenaed the guy's phone records, texts, calls, timestamps. As the bailiff handed over the stack of proof, the judge looked at the ex and said, "You lied in my courtroom. But worse, you thought I wouldn't catch you. That's not just arrogance. That's stupidity. And stupidity in court is expensive." Silence like snowfall. You could hear a pen drop. Restraining order granted on the spot. Story 15. A custody hearing. The father hadn't seen his kids in over a year. Suddenly wanted full custody. Claimed the mother was emotionally unstable because she had posted emotional poems on Facebook during the breakup. The judge raised an eyebrow, looked at the post, and said, "If writing poetry about heartbreak made someone unfit to parent, Shakespeare's mom would have lost custody centuries ago." There was this beat of confusion, then total, utter silence. The dad's case fell apart. Full custody stayed with the mother. That line? It's been framed in my office ever since. Story 16. This happened in a small-town courtroom during a civil dispute about a damaged fence. The plaintiff was this grumpy old guy who kept calling the defendant an idiot, and even once called him a backwoods moron with the IQ of a potato. The judge had clearly had enough. He leaned over his bench and said, "Mister, Bowers, if you keep referring to others as idiots, I'm going to need to subpoena a mirror so you can testify against yourself. It was dead quiet. Even the plaintiff's own attorney chuckled, then tried to hide it. The plaintiff shut up. They settled by the next recess. Story 17. Family Law. The father's attorney was trying to discredit the mother by bringing up the fact that she had been laid off during COVID and was still unemployed. He made it sound like she was lazy and irresponsible, while ignoring the fact that she was caring for 3 kids and taking online classes. The judge didn't even wait for the mother's response. He cut in and said, "Counselor, I'd love to see you try raising 3 kids under 5 while job hunting in a collapsed economy, but I suspect your idea of parenting ends at buying an iPad." The courtroom was absolutely still. The lawyer muttered something and sat down. The mother won full custody. Story 18. A criminal hearing. Young man caught breaking into a convenience store. His defense? He claimed he didn't really steal anything and just needed a place to sleep. He was caught on camera eating chips behind the register and sleeping in the storage. The judge, after hearing all this, looked directly at the defendant and said, "This isn't Airbnb, Mr. Simmons. Breaking and entering doesn't come with room service." The courtroom laughed for a split second, then instantly silenced when the judge slammed the gavel. The guy pled guilty shortly after. Story 19. Divorce court. Husband was trying to argue that his wife's depression made her an unfit mother. He brought in her therapy records, twisted them completely out of context, and painted a picture of instability. The judge flipped through the file, closed it, and said, "Mr. Keller, seeking help for depression makes someone a responsible adult. Exploiting that to win custody makes someone a manipulative coward." The silence after that was thick. You could see even the court reporter pause her typing for a moment. The wife cried. She kept custody. Rightfully so. Story 20. Civil trial. Contractor sued a homeowner for breach of contract. Problem? The contractor did horrible work. Half-finished roof, electrical violations, unsafe stairs, but still wanted full payment. His defense was that the homeowner had unrealistic standards. The judge walked through the photo evidence, turned the page, then said, "If these are your standards for completed work, I hope you never go into surgery." Silence. Total, consuming silence. Case dismissed. Contractor left red-faced and speechless. Story 21. This was a juvenile court case. A teenage boy had been caught vandalizing a local business. He wasn't a bad kid, just caught up with some troublemakers. His attorney tried to explain his background, poverty, neglect, no father figure, and asked for leniency. The prosecutor rolled his eyes and sarcastically said, "Your Honor, we can't blame all bad behavior on daddy issues." The judge went still, then said in a low, deliberate voice, "Mr. Collins, a lack of empathy is not a legal strategy. And if your father's absence didn't teach you compassion, this courtroom will." Silence. Pure cold silence. Even the prosecutor didn't speak for the rest of the session. The judge gave the teen community service and a mentor. It was the right call. Story 22. Employment dispute case. A manager was being sued for wrongful termination after firing a female employee for poor attitude, which turned out to be her standing up to his creepy behavior. He tried to defend himself by saying, "I never touched her. A compliment isn't harassment. Maybe she just can't take a joke." The judge, without even looking up from her notes, replied, "Mr. Dean, if your sense of humor requires someone else's discomfort, it belongs in a diary, not a workplace." You could feel the blood drain from his face. The courtroom was still as stone. Verdict? In favor of the plaintiff, with damages. Brutal and deserved. Story 23. I was a paralegal during this case. A landlord was trying to evict a disabled tenant for violating quiet hours because her medical equipment made noise. He stood there, smugly explaining how the beeping disturbed the neighbors. The judge narrowed her eyes and asked, "Let me clarify. You're evicting a woman for trying to stay alive?" He tried to stammer out something about community standards, but the judge interrupted, "Mr. Raines, if your building can't accommodate the sound of survival, maybe it's your morals that need eviction." Dead silence. Even the bailiff looked stunned. Case thrown out immediately. Story 24. Custody battle. The father's lawyer presented pages of social media screenshots showing the mother posting inappropriate selfies. Nothing scandalous, just basic gym mirror pics and her in a Halloween costume. The lawyer smugly asked if that kind of behavior was fit for a mother. The judge stared for a second, then said, "Counselor, if parenting were judged by Instagram filters, I'd be an orphan." There was a moment where the entire courtroom processed what just happened. The lawyer flushed. The father avoided eye contact. The mother won joint custody. Story 25. This was an elder abuse case. The grandson had been siphoning money from his grandmother's account for months. Bought himself a motorcycle, new wardrobe, even a trip to Vegas. His excuse? She wasn't using it anyway. The judge let him talk for a while, then asked, Mr. Langston, do you also help yourself to unattended wallets at restaurants? Or is this level of theft reserved only for family? The silence was palpable, like someone had hit mute on the world. Langston blinked, looked down, and didn't speak again. He was ordered to repay every cent, plus court fees. Story 26. This was a lawsuit filed by a guy who claimed emotional distress after being ghosted by a woman he met on a dating app. I'm not kidding. He filed actual paperwork claiming psychological damage and loss of romantic investment. He even brought a printout of their chat logs with highlighted emotional commitments. The judge flipped through it silently for a minute, then asked, Mr. Hanley, do you believe the legal system is your personal therapist? Dead silence. The guy looked completely stunned. Judge added, case dismissed. And if you ever find love again, I suggest flowers instead of subpoenas. Whole courtroom had to hold in laughter. The plaintiff walked out without saying another word. Story 27. In a fraud case, this guy tried to represent himself and insisted he'd done nothing wrong. Despite clear evidence, he'd forged multiple signatures on loan documents. His big defense was, everyone bends the truth a little. The judge raised one eyebrow and said, Mr. Powell, you didn't bend the truth. You steamrolled it, buried it, and forged its obituary. I swear you could hear the air conditioner kick on. The guy looked like a balloon deflating. Jury was visibly impressed by the line. Verdict didn't go his way, obviously. Story 28. Tenant-landlord dispute. The landlord hadn't fixed the heat in the dead of winter, and the tenant had a newborn baby. The landlord argued that he didn't know it was that cold, and that the tenant should have bought more blankets. The judge stared at him and said, if your child was freezing, would you tell them to layer up, or would you fix the damn heater? Silence. The landlord's mouth opened, but nothing came out. You could tell he knew it was over. Full judgment for the tenant, and an extra fine for violating local housing codes. Story 29. I was sitting in court watching my mentor during a medical malpractice case. The defense tried to argue that a nurse forgetting to check a chart wasn't truly negligence, just a human mistake. The judge leaned in and said, a surgeon doesn't get to say oops after slicing the wrong artery. In medicine, human mistakes cost lives. In court, they cost money. Dead quiet. The defendant's lawyer fumbled with his papers like they were going to form a better argument somehow. They didn't. We won big. Story 30. This was a divorce trial, and the husband had hired a private investigator to dig into the wife's every move. He brought up that she had gone to a bar once, danced with a male friend, and got home after midnight. The judge looked annoyed, then leaned forward and said, did she also cast a spell and turn your pumpkin into a carriage? What exactly is the crime here? Being single before the ink dried. Silence. Audible from every corner of the room. The husband's face turned red. His attorney didn't even try to push forward. The judge awarded a swift and favorable ruling for the wife. Story 31. This one was a petty defamation case. A local influencer was suing a bakery for supposedly calling her unprofessional in a private email that got leaked. She claimed it hurt her brand and demanded thousands in damages. She showed up to court in full glam, treated it like a press event, and even tried to hand the judge her business card. The judge didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the card like it was radioactive. Then he said, Miss Harmon, this is a courtroom, not a red carpet. If your brand is that fragile, perhaps you shouldn't build it on icing sugar and hashtags. You could feel the silence settle like fog. She didn't say another word until she left. Case dismissed. Judge even waived the bakery's court costs. Story 32. Civil case involving a neighbor dispute. One neighbor sued the other for emotional distress because their kids played too loudly in the yard. No injuries, no threats, just laughing kids. The plaintiff went on a rant about noise pollution, childish screeching, and how he couldn't meditate properly. The judge leaned back and said, Mr. Lyle, if the sound of children playing gives you emotional distress, I suggest therapy. Or earplugs. Possibly both. Silence. Except for the tiniest chuckle from someone in the back, quickly stifled. Case thrown out before the first recess. Story 33. Criminal sentencing for a guy caught shoplifting high-end alcohol from a grocery store. His reasoning? He said he was going through a breakup and wanted to feel something. The judge flipped through the arrest report, then looked him straight in the eye and said, most people buy a pint of ice cream. You decided on grand larceny. Whole room froze. Guy stammered something like, I didn't think, and the judge cut him off. Clearly, sentence was light, but that line haunted him worse than the fine. I guarantee it. Story 34. I was shadowing during a restraining order. The woman was seeking protection from a coworker who kept showing up uninvited at her home and sending dozens of texts a day. His defense? He said, "I'm just persistent. That's how people fall in love." The judge sat silently for a few moments, then said, "This isn't a rom-com, Mr. Gaines. When the woman says no and you keep going, it's not persistence. It's stalking." Silence so deep you could hear the tension crackle. Restraining order granted. Rightfully so. Story 35. A tenant was suing their landlord for the most outrageous rent hike I'd ever seen. Nearly double, overnight. The landlord tried to justify it by saying, "Well, the building has historical value now." Judge replied, "A fresh coat of paint and a made-up plaque from Etsy don't make your Roach Motel a landmark." Dead silence. Everyone stared at the landlord like he'd just been roasted on live TV. Full judgment for the tenant and a city inspection ordered. Story 36. I was working as an assistant for a real estate attorney, and we were in court over a dispute between two neighbors fighting over a few inches of property. One of them had literally moved their fence 2 feet into the other's yard. The guy's justification? "I mow it more often, so I think I deserve it." The judge blinked a few times, then asked, "Mr. Renner, if I vacuum your living room, do I get to move in?" Silence. Beautiful, cold silence. The man actually tried to laugh like it was a joke. The judge wasn't smiling. Fence had to be moved, and he got slapped with all legal fees. Story 37. A guy was suing his ex for emotional damages because she broke up with him after he cheated. Yes, you read that right. He cheated, and then tried to claim she manipulated him into loving and caused heartbreak-related distress. The judge listened with a straight face until the guy compared her to a Venus flytrap who lured him in. That's when the judge said, "Mr. Davis, she didn't trap you. You walked in uninvited and ate yourself alive." The courtroom didn't make a sound. The ex just shook her head. Case dismissed. Swift and surgical. Story 38. A corporate representative was on the stand defending a company accused of firing an employee for being pregnant. The rep smugly said, "We were just concerned about her long-term availability." The judge didn't even hesitate. "You mean you were concerned she might choose motherhood over being exploited?" The words hit the room like a bomb. The rep just sat there, blinking. You could feel the chill ripple through the air. The plaintiff won that case, and the company took a PR beating after. Story 39. Small town court. A guy had been ticketed for having a dozen unregistered chickens in his backyard, breaking city code. But he insisted they were emotional support animals, and got very theatrical about how each one has a name and soul. The judge said, "Mr. Burke, if I find out you're charging rent for chicken coops, I'm declaring you a landlord and taxing you accordingly." The room burst into held-back laughter, but one look from the judge shut it right back down. Fine upheld. Coop cleared. Story 40. This happened during a heated contract dispute. One of the lawyers kept talking over everyone. Opposing counsel, the witness, even the judge. He was aggressive, rude, and completely full of himself. Finally, after the 4th interruption in 5 minutes, the judge said, "Mr. Green, if interrupting were a legal skill, you'd be partner by now. Unfortunately, it's just annoying." Silence. His co-counsel quietly nudged him to sit down. From then on, he only spoke when asked a direct question. It was glorious. Story 41. I was the paralegal on a fraud case involving a guy who scammed multiple elderly women through fake online dating profiles. He'd pretend to be a widower or a retired military officer, emotionally manipulate them, then get them to send money under the guise of emergency travel or sick relatives. The case had mountains of text messages, receipts, and bank transfers to prove it. He walked into court dressed like a Wall Street broker and smirked through the prosecution's entire presentation. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply shrugged and said, "I never forced them. They gave me the money. Can't blame me for being charming." The courtroom was dead quiet already. But then the judge took off his glasses and said, calm as anything, "Mr. Langdon, you didn't con these women because you're charming. You did it because you're a predator who mistook kindness for stupidity. And now you're going to prison, where charm is in much shorter supply." There wasn't a sound in the room, not a shuffle, not a cough. Even the defendant finally shut his mouth. He got the maximum sentence, and not a single person felt bad for him. Story 42. During a medical malpractice case, the hospital's legal team was being especially aggressive toward the patient, a woman who had nearly died due to a botched anesthesia dosage during what should have been a routine procedure. She was permanently affected, both physically and mentally, and her life had taken a dramatic downturn. But the hospital's attorney kept hammering her with questions like she was trying to scam them. At one point, he sneered, So you're saying one mistake means the whole hospital's liable? The judge leaned forward and said, one mistake? Counsel, if I walked into this courtroom drunk and sentenced someone to life by accident, would you call it just one mistake? Or would you demand accountability for every ounce of suffering it caused? The silence in that room was instant. You could see the defense attorney's jaw clench as he quietly muttered, no further questions. The judge later ruled in favor of the woman, and with strong language that sent a message. Story 43. This happened during a divorce hearing that spiraled into an all-out. The husband, who had cheated multiple times, tried to gain sympathy by claiming his wife emotionally neglected him. He said, I just felt like she stopped appreciating me, so yeah, I made mistakes. But a man needs to feel value. The judge took a slow breath and said, Mr. Hammond, if your self-worth is so fragile that it collapses without applause, perhaps you should have married a mirror. You could hear the exhale from everyone in the room. His lawyer didn't even react, just stared at the floor. The wife smiled for the first time that day. She got the house, custody, and alimony. Story 44. I sat in on a bizarre defamation case where a local radio host was suing a teacher who'd called him a blow-dried buffoon in a tweet. That was it. The host argued it harmed his professional image and that he was now a laughingstock in the community. The judge asked, do you host a comedy segment on your radio show? The plaintiff nodded proudly. And do you make fun of people on air? All the time, he grinned. The judge nodded, then said, then congratulations, Mr. Aldridge. You've discovered that jokes sometimes boomerang. Case dismissed. And if being called a buffoon bothers you, perhaps you should reconsider your buffoonery. Silence, except for one very quiet snort from the back of the gallery. The host walked out without saying a word, visibly humiliated. Story 45. During a business litigation case, a CEO was being sued by a group of former employees for unpaid overtime and wrongful termination. His defense was that they were entitled millennials who didn't understand hustle culture. When the judge asked if he was aware of labor laws regarding mandatory breaks and overtime pay, the CEO smirked and said, I run a startup, Your Honor. We don't operate on time clocks, we operate on passion. The judge just stared at him for a moment and replied, Mr. Klein, passion doesn't pay rent. And in this courtroom, we operate on law. That was it? Silence like a void. You could see the CEO's confidence evaporate as the courtroom shifted against him. He lost. Badly. Story 46. A wealthy father was in court trying to fight his child support payments. Despite earning a seven-figure salary, he argued that paying $1,200 a month was crippling and not reflective of his current financial situation. His ex had sole custody and worked 2 jobs to keep things afloat. He tried to spin it like he was the victim, saying, she doesn't need my money. She needs to manage hers better. The judge didn't even blink. He just said, Mr. Dwyer, if you think $1,200 is crippling, I can't wait to hear how you define fatherhood. The room went silent. The father looked like he'd been punched in the soul. Judge bumped the payments up by another $500 and added a reminder about what best interests of the child actually means. Story 47. Landlord-tenant case. The tenant had video evidence of mushrooms growing out of the ceiling from water damage. The landlord tried to argue that it was just mildew and accused the tenant of making a fuss over nothing. Judge reviewed the footage, put the folder down and said, Sir, unless you're turning the apartment into a pizza, there should not be mushrooms involved. There was a pause. Nobody laughed because it wasn't a joke. The landlord's smirk dropped like a rock. Full reimbursement plus inspection ordered. Silence hung in the air until the next case was called. Story 48. Civil case. A man was suing his former friend over an unpaid loan, which had been clearly documented. The defendant didn't deny it, but said, we were friends. Friends don't take each other to court. The judge responded without looking up from his notes, and friends don't steal $9,000 under the promise of paying it back. So, which one of you stopped being a friend first? You could hear every breath stop in the room. The defendant looked like he'd shrunk in his chair. Judgment for the plaintiff. Immediate payment ordered. Story 49. This was a public nuisance case. A homeowner was blasting music at 2 a.m. every weekend and throwing parties that spilled into neighbors' yards. When taken to court, his defense was, I'm just living my life. If people can't handle that, they should move. The judge, after hearing testimony from multiple exhausted neighbors, looked him dead in the eyes and said, you're not living your life. You're intruding on everyone else's. This isn't Coachella, Mr. Avery. It's a residential zone. Dead silence. Like kill a mosquito with its silence. The man looked stunned. Noise curfew and fines enforced on the spot. Story 50. This one was wild. A man was fighting a shoplifting charge for stealing high-end perfume from a department store. His defense? It wasn't stealing. I left a tip at the counter before I walked out. The entire courtroom kind of froze already, but the judge leaned in and said, Mr. Grant, leaving $1 after stealing 100 is not generosity. It's arithmetic stupidity. No one, not the attorneys, not the audience, not even Mr. Grant. Convicted. And probably the shortest closing argument the prosecution ever had to give. Story 51. This was a case involving a guy who sued a gym after injuring himself while using equipment improperly. He claimed there were no visible instructions, and that staff should have stopped him from lifting more than he could handle. The gym's lawyer pulled out a waiver he'd signed, along with a recording of the plaintiff ignoring a trainer's warning on camera. Still, the guy kept arguing that machines should be smarter, and that accidents happen because people don't know any better. The judge leaned forward and said, Mr. Vance, if you're blaming dumb decisions on inanimate objects, I suggest you avoid mirrors for the rest of your life. Silence. Pure and absolute. He dropped the case 2 days later. Story 52. I was assisting on a custody case. The father had a history of DUIs and inconsistent visitation, but his lawyer came in swinging, trying to paint the mother as emotionally volatile for crying during her testimony. At one point, the lawyer said, Is someone who can't control her emotions fit to raise a child? The judge gave a long pause, then responded, Mr. Lawson, if shedding tears while fighting for your child is weakness, then every good parent I've ever met must be unfit. The courtroom was stone silent. Even opposing counsel looked stunned. The mother was granted primary custody, and the lawyer's tone changed drastically after that. Story 53. In a bizarre contract dispute, a man was suing a tattoo artist for emotional trauma after getting a misspelled quote on his forearm. The kicker? He chose the spelling despite the artist suggesting a correction. In court, he pulled up his sleeve to reveal, no regrets, spelled no regrets. The judge raised an eyebrow and said, Mr. Fisher, if you wanted sympathy, you should have at least proofread your skin before turning it into a legal exhibit. The gallery held back laughs. The plaintiff flushed bright red. Case dismissed within the hour. Story 54. During a civil suit over a destroyed engagement ring, the ex-fiancé claimed the woman owed him thousands because she flushed the ring down the toilet after he cheated. His logic? She overreacted. That ring was an investment. The judge gave him a long stare and asked, Did she ask you to cheat? Or was that part of your investment strategy too? He mumbled something about being drunk. The judge cut him off. Then consider the ring flushed under the consequences of your own actions clause. The room froze. The woman smiled. Case dismissed with a warning about wasting the court's time. Story 55. This one was a wild one, an HOA lawsuit. A man was being sued for painting his front door red, which the HOA claimed violated their policy of natural tones only. He brought receipts showing it had been approved by a former board member in writing. The HOA rep argued, It sets a precedent for rebellion in the neighborhood. The judge stared at her for a long second, then said, Ms. Darnell, if a red door is your version of rebellion, I suggest you never open a history book. You could hear someone whisper, damn, under their breath. The judge ruled in favor of the homeowner, with a side comment about real problems deserving real courts. Story 56. This was a harassment protection order hearing. A woman had filed against her co-worker, who had been sending her unsolicited poems, gifts, and emails daily, even after she'd asked him to stop multiple times. He represented himself and told the judge, I was just being romantic. That's not illegal. The judge leaned back, hands folded, and said, Mr. Crenshaw, Romeo didn't get a restraining order because Juliet liked him back. You missed that part. You could feel the second-hand embarrassment ripple through the room. Protection order granted immediately. Crenshaw looked like he'd just realized he was the villain in his own love story. Story 57. A small business owner was being sued by a customer who claimed he had a spiritual allergy to plastic and that the store traumatized him by handing him a bag. The guy acted like he was a martyr, insisting he'd suffered existential dread from the experience. The defendant sat in stunned silence as the plaintiff ranted about auras, toxic packaging, and the soul of the earth. The judge paused, looked down at the file, then said, Mr. Rogers, if plastic bags give you existential dread, may I suggest avoiding the legal system entirely? You could hear the courtroom exhale in unison. The plaintiff tried to object, but the judge banged the gavel and dismissed the case before he could speak again. Story 58. Criminal sentencing. The defendant had a long list of prior charges, mostly petty theft, but now he was up for breaking into He gave a long speech blaming the broken system, saying, I'm not a criminal, I'm a product of society. The judge let him finish, then said calmly, Mr. Jennings, society didn't sneak through a window and steal a television. That was you. Silence. No one moved. Even the bailiff stopped mid-step. He got a stern sentence, but what really stuck with him was that line. I overheard him repeating it to his lawyer in disbelief. Story 59. Divorce court. The husband was fighting to avoid paying spousal support, claiming his wife didn't contribute financially during their 15-year marriage. She had raised 3 kids, ran the household, and even helped him start his business, but he brushed all of that off as easy stuff. The judge didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. He just said, Mr. Harlan, if raising children and managing a household is so easy, I'll be sure to hire you as my next nanny. The man looked ready to evaporate. He didn't say a word after that. The wife was awarded support, and for once, it felt like the system actually got it right. Story 60. Tenant was suing a landlord for refusing to return a security deposit after the lease ended. The landlord said he kept the money because the tenant didn't clean the fridge thoroughly and left a single sock under the bed. The judge stared blankly for a few seconds, then said, Mr. Callahan, you're charging $1,200 for a sock and a smudge. This isn't Sotheby's. You're not selling art. The courtroom was frozen. The landlord's jaw clicked shut. Full deposit returned with interest, plus court costs. Absolute silence as the judge signed the order and called the next case. Story 61. This was a workplace harassment case. A female employee had been subjected to months of inappropriate comments and unwanted attention from her boss. His defense? I was just being friendly. She took it the wrong way. The judge didn't flinch. Mr. Holloway, he said slowly, if your idea of being friendly causes HR complaints, lawsuits, and restraining orders, maybe the problem isn't how she takes it. Maybe it's how you dish it out. The silence afterward was ice cold. Even the boss's lawyer didn't look up. Full judgment in the woman's favor, plus a recommendation for workplace sensitivity training, the judge insisted be personally attended by Mr. Holloway. Story 62. This happened during a personal injury case. The plaintiff was suing a trampoline park for a broken wrist. They argued the park didn't do enough to prevent injuries. But surveillance showed him double-flipping into a do not enter area, past 3 warning signs. When confronted with the video, he said, well, I thought those signs were just suggestions. The judge leaned in and said, Mr. Keller, stop signs are suggestions too, until someone runs one and ends up in court. Dead quiet. The jury looked at each other. No one needed further explanation. Case dismissed. The plaintiff left faster than he'd flipped into that restricted zone. Story 63. In a probate court, a woman was contesting her father's will because she believed her brother had manipulated their dad into leaving him. She had no evidence, just vibes and old grudges. She even accused her brother of weaponizing kindness. The judge rubbed his temple and said, Ms. Patel, being nice to your father while he was alive isn't a crime. But dragging his name through court out of spite? That's not exactly daughter of the year behavior either. The silence hit like a hammer. Her lawyer didn't say another word for the rest of the hearing. The will stood. Her brother walked out in tears, not of sadness but relief. Story 64. A man was suing his mechanic after his car broke down a month post-repair. The mechanic provided receipts, diagnostic logs, and photos. The plaintiff? Just angry vibes and a statement that said, I don't trust mechanics. After an hour of going in circles, the judge said, Mr. Greer, this isn't Yelp. Distrust is not a legal argument. You could hear several suppressed laughs. The plaintiff looked shocked. But I feel like he didn't fix it right, he insisted. The judge raised a brow. And I feel like dismissing this right now, which I will. Boom. Case closed. Room silent. Mechanic nodded, satisfied. Story 65. In a housing discrimination case, a landlord was accused of refusing to rent to a couple because of their race. The landlord claimed he just had a gut feeling they weren't a good fit, and that it wasn't personal. The judge looked up, dead serious, and said, racism disguised as a gut feeling is still racism. The only thing you're full of is bias. The silence in that courtroom was chilling. The landlord's face turned red, then white. His attorney tried to pivot, but it was too late. The couple won, and the judge referred the case for further investigation under fair housing law. Story 66. This one happened during a fraud trial. The defendant had scammed several small businesses with fake invoices and shady vendor contracts. When confronted, his defense was, they should have done their due diligence. I just created opportunity. The judge blinked, leaned forward slightly and said, Mr. Latham, that wasn't opportunity. That was theft dressed up in a cheap suit. And just like your excuses, it doesn't fit. The courtroom froze. The gallery went quiet. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. The guy didn't say another word for the rest of the trial. Maximum penalty handed down. Deserved. Story 67. Family court. This one was rough. A father was trying to regain custody after disappearing from his daughter's life for 5 years. No contact, no support, nothing. He claimed he was finding himself and traveling to heal. When asked why he never called or wrote, he said, "I didn't want to confuse her." The judge stared at him for a long time, then said, "You weren't avoiding confusion. You were avoiding responsibility. Children aren't paused when you leave. They just grow up without you." The silence after that was absolute. The mother held back tears. The man just sat there, quietly crumbling. Custody remained with the mother. No appeal filed. Story 68. Civil court. A man sued a local restaurant for emotional damage because they accidentally served him regular milk instead of oat milk in his coffee. He wasn't allergic. He just claimed it violated his vegan lifestyle and made him feel betrayed. The judge sighed so hard it echoed and said, "Mr. Dalton, if moral betrayal by milk is your greatest trauma, I envy your life." The plaintiff's face turned beet red. He tried to respond, but the judge held up a hand. "You're dismissed. And don't come back unless dairy personally assaults." Courtroom was dead quiet. And honestly, that judge deserves a medal. Story 69. A landlord was in court after evicting a tenant midwinter without notice. He'd shut off the heat and changed the locks because the tenant had too many guests over and left dishes in the sink. He actually said, "I run a clean house. I don't tolerate filth." The judge narrowed his eyes and said, "Mr. Krantz, you don't run a house. You run a lease. And a lease isn't a kingdom. You don't get to play king." It was like the entire room forgot how to breathe. Tenant won triple damages. Landlord just nodded, defeated. Story 7. This happened in small claims. A guy was suing his ex for taking their dog after the breakup. No custody agreement, no legal claim. He just said, she didn't deserve him. She was too emotional. She showed photos of herself and the dog since it was a puppy, vet bills, and videos of the dog choosing her every time. The judge watched the footage and then asked, "Mr. Burke, is your ego really worth more than this dog's happiness?" The man said nothing. The judge continued, "Because from what I see, he already chose. And I don't overrule dogs." The gallery let out a few chuckles before realizing how serious the judge was. The dog stayed with her. Case closed. Story 71. This one happened in a corporate case where a company tried to dodge liability for a factory accident that left a worker permanently disabled. Their lawyer argued that the worker should have used more common sense and that we're not responsible for individual decision-making. The judge took a long pause before responding. Then, "Counselor, if your safety procedures rely on common sense instead of regulations, you're not running a company. You're running a lottery." And this man lost. Total silence. Not a shuffle, not a breath. Even the defendant's legal team looked shaken. The company settled within 48 hours of that hearing, very quietly. Story 72. Landlord-tenant dispute. The tenant had video evidence of black mold, busted pipes, and rats in the walls. The landlord's excuse? "That building's been in my family for generations. It has character." The judge didn't even blink before saying, "Mr. Peterson, character doesn't make tenants sick. Mold does. And unless your family also passed down a hazmat suit, you owe this man a refund and a written apology." You could hear the tenant exhale like he'd been holding his breath all year. Full judgment awarded plus inspection penalties. The landlord didn't say another word, just packed up his paperwork and left. Story 73. In a bizarre small claims case, a woman sued her roommate for emotional harm because the roommate's boyfriend looked at her weirdly. No touching, no harassment, just, as she put it, constant unsettling vibes. When asked if she had any evidence of misconduct, she said, "No, but I felt it." The judge leaned forward and said, "Miss Reynolds, we're not prosecuting feelings. This is a court of law, not an episode of Scooby-Doo." The room went dead quiet. Her own lawyer leaned back and whispered something that sounded like, "I told you so." Case dismissed in under 5 minutes. Story 74. A man was contesting a speeding ticket by claiming he wasn't actually driving fast. He was just trying to keep up with traffic. The officer had him on radar going 85 in a 55. His argument? Everyone else was doing it too. The judge gave him a look and said, "Mr. Clark, if everyone else drove into a lake, would you follow? Or would you accelerate so you could be first?" The courtroom was silent. The guy let out a tiny, "Oh, fair, fine upheld, license points applied." His girlfriend next to him shook her head and mouthed, "I told you." Story 75. Divorce case. Husband was a tech bro who made millions but didn't want to split assets. He argued that his wife didn't contribute to his success and just stayed home with the kids. He even said she got a free ride for 10 years. The judge, a woman in her 60s, put down her pen and said, "Sir, if parenting 3 children, running a household, and keeping your life on track is a free ride, then I suggest you take it for a week and see if you survive." You could hear the air disappear from the room. The husband turned red. His lawyer stopped taking notes. The wife won half plus spousal support. She earned every cent.